Good afternoon and welcome to this session on knowledge needs, where we will focus very much on the needs linked to EU and Africa interactions, looking at secure and sustainable supply of raw materials. Our first speaker, so I have the great pleasure to introduce our director, Giovanni de Santi, from JRC's Directorate on Sustainable Resources. Giovanni.
So thank you, David, and good afternoon to all of you. I think it's particularly, let's say, close to the Raw Material Week and Raw Material community, because I remember when I was appointed director of Directorate D, so for Sustainable Resources in JRC, this was my very first official talk, and today is going to be likely the very last as director in the JRC. So I'm very happy and honored to launch, as I did launch 5 years ago, the Rmis 2.0, which was in fact the very first open Rmis to the public audience. Now we launch this kind of extension towards Africa. So I think that my destiny is very much close to the destiny of Rmis. So Africa, I do agree that EU and Africa, they should have an intensive dialogue. We know, I always said that there is no prosperous, healthy, Europe without a prosperous and healthy Africa. They are so close and they need, therefore, to be always in contact and cooperate and have, in this sense, we need to facilitate a fair, green, and responsible source of raw material. So concern raw material, definitely we need to have a continuous change in trading, in understanding, in scientific knowledge, and whatsoever. So welcome this initiative to have a kind of dedicated session to the Africa. This is why in JRC we have produced the very first Africa Knowledge Platform. This is a new initiative, which I hope will be very useful more and more in the future, because this means that we want to intensify the exchange of news, the exchange of analysis on different fronts among European and African colleagues, European and African scientists, but also practitioners. So all the people that are interested to know what's going on in between Africa and Europe. And so this is a kind of incentive to a stimulation to share knowledge and also to support better and better policy making on the two fronts. So again, this African Knowledge Platform has been set up by the JRC and is now already available, and we hope that will become more and more an entry point for whoever wants to know in a very synthetic and a smart way what's the relationship, what are the projects, what are the results in different fronts among Europe and Africa. So again, I simply want to say today we are here to talk about raw material, of course, and you know that raw material was and still even more a key issue, a bottleneck for many strategic sectors of our economy. And again, we know that now all countries and regions now they are facing under unprecedented challenges because, again, the demand of raw material is going to increase. If you simply look at how to meet demands from Green Deal, for digitalization, for low carbon society, and also for special sectors like defense. So it's clear that raw material will be and will continue to be a key issue for our future economy, in terms of security, so resilience, in terms of sustainability, in terms of economic viability, competitiveness, and so on. So this is why I want simply to say we get use of this raw material information system, so the Rmis, that again, I remember we launched the version 2.0 5 years ago. And what is this? The raw material, again and again, if you remember, was linked to the Circular Economy Action Plan in 2016. So it's the reference knowledge platform of the European Commission for non-food, of course, and non-energy raw material. And again, it does give the foundation, it does give the science, the results, the knowledge in support of a fair and sustainable policy in what concerns the raw material. So to have a policy related to raw material, value chain. This is very important because otherwise you can find yourself in front of contradicting policy for different sectors that they do not consider each other. So this raw material information is a cross point, is a kind of common forum whereby you can exchange data and you can make complementary decision on both primary raw material but also secondary raw materials. So just to underpin, just to support this raw material information system, now GRC and my directorate, but not only my directorate, we have developed a series of projects focused on strategic value chains. It's very important that we do look at the entire chain of strategic value with, of course, a focus on raw materials. So this is very important because we need, as I said, the mission of GRC is to support the other policy DG. So this is facilitate us to support working closely with the different DGs, but also to support member states and also to support many stakeholders. So we have many projects. Just to give an example, we have published recently in the frame of the communication for critical raw material action plan in 2020, we have published a foresight study, which was under the leadership of the Vice President Sefcovic, because it was important, and this was done in a full collaboration with many directorates in the GRC, with the GROW, so we did provide this kind of for what's going next, because we need to look forward. And just to give a simple example or conclusion, we anticipated the use and the need of cobalt, that is already critical material now, but is going to increase a lot, 5 times on respect today, the need for cobalt in 2030, and 15 times more by 2050. So cobalt is going to be more and more a critical material whereby we need to understand how to deal in the future with an increase in demand. This is just to give you an example of what this study does say, so how we need to be prepared to the ongoing development of industry. We have looked at many other aspects. For example, criticality. Again, that's another aspect that we need to consider for raw material. And again, another example still related to cobalt, but it's not only cobalt. So we do have many raw materials that are imported from, let's say, poor governance countries, whereby you can never see and you can never be sure how it will be managed in the future. And again, the cobalt is a very typical example because 60% of cobalt is coming just from the Republic of Congo. So again, you need to wonder and you need to ask yourself what are the risks associated with importing mostly from one country like Congo, which again needs some kind of support also from political point of view. We have the social aspect. Again, this is very important because, again, if you do look at the study published by the United Nations Environment, they estimate that 40% globally, 40% of internal conflicts are simply originated by the exploitation of natural resources. So again, once more, raw material, natural resources are at the bone, at the source of many conflicts. So the social aspect is going to be very important. Of course, mining, extrapolate, but also working, so processing raw materials does give also positive consequences because it does create jobs, it does give income. But again, if it is not properly managed, again, we do have this kind of social conflict and social consequence. So again, it's not just economic viability, but also the social aspect and definitely the environmental aspect, as I said before. So the environment has been also highlighted by the Environment Agency, which again said that if you do look at simply the overall greenhouse gas emission linked to the total consumption based, you see that 18% is simply due to the extraction and processing. So again, we do need to go via the entire life cycle analysis, to entire value chain, so that you need to adopt what we in GRC and in the Commission we are going to adopt for many other policies. So for example, the new the new consumption or the new product policy, sustainable product policy initiative, or for the consumption, we will adopt this kind of life cycle analysis approach with the environmental footprint, with the social footprint, so there will be a transparent, unique, and harmonized methodology to understand the environmental impact of different products, and you can compare them all. But you do look at the environmental or social impact from the very extraction phase to the last consumption. So consumption, demand side, supply side are equally important, and we cannot even more consider to develop policies that do consider one side of the medal. We need to go across the policy cycle and the value cycle. So that's what I said, also for raw material, but also for all products, all other, including food, we will apply the same kind of a methodology to have a transparent, unbiased, transparent method, so that in future you may compare one product to another that in the past they were not comparable, and this is very important. So as I said, it's important the criticality aspect, it's important the social, the environmental, and that's why I welcome very much this session, which is going now to be led by different distinguished experts. First of all, from different DGs, from 4 DGs, so GROW, I know environment, I know RTD, so I think that, and GSC, so I think that it's important that from different perspective, from different policy perspective, also within the Commission, we do have a vision how they do want to see in the future the policy development concerning the raw material and the different strategic value chain, and also for the international organization. So we have representatives from different international organizations, and more than ever, also from African colleagues or African organizations. So this is very important that you start to discuss among us. And just to make the very last comment, because we know that we have a good level of knowledge, as I said, with Rmis, with many other attempts. We know a lot more than what we did know in the past. We have now country profile, as will be now presented by Costantino. So we do have now a better way to understand pro and cons, how you get profit from what you have and where you can better trade with others. So we do know a lot, but we still have many gaps to fill, many issues whereby we do need to collaborate much more to exchange data from primary, but also for secondary material, including all the, as I said, the entire cycle. So including recycling, reusing, re-emitting the products in the economic cycle. So I think that it's important that this session will give, again, another step, another contribution, to progress in whatever is necessary, again, to avoid that in future any policy concerning product or concerning energy or concerning food, they do not, first of all, they do not talk to each other. Second, they are based on different and maybe contradicting input. And instead, they should have a kind of synergies. They should come from the same evidence. And these scientific debates, with also practitioners, also with industry stakeholders, is the way we need to look forward and avoid this kind of dangerous situation whereby we ended up in a situation where we understand only at the end of the story, at the end of the path, that we did forget something for social aspect or environmental aspect or economic viability. So thanks a lot, and again, I'm very eager to listen to these distinguished speakers, because again, this is one of the key issues for the GSC, how to develop cross-cutting tools, methodology, understanding that will make any kind of decision or initiative of the Commission sustainable from 360 degrees analysis. And this is what the SEGEN, the Commissioner, wants, to have a kind of really integrated approach. And we do need this kind of tools to be further developed. Thank you.
Thank you, Giovanni, for this first opening speech, and for this overview of your recent career and your massive impact, I would say, on what our directorate's achieved in supporting this area, working closely, of course, with DG GROW and other policy DGs. So on that point, I think it's also a great pleasure to then move to our next speaker, who is Peter Handley, who's the head of unit for the energy-intensive industries and raw materials at DG GROW. So you've seen him around throughout this whole week in various key roles. I would also like to thank Peter's team and Peter himself, of course, for this opportunity for this session and the vision for this session, particularly Helena, who has supported me very closely with putting this together and with the concept and so forth. And then Francisca from your team, who has been extremely interactive with us and supportive on the logistics. So thank you very much also, Peter, and your team. So Peter Handley will now give us an introduction to European Union's raw materials policy and how that links to Africa. Peter.
Thank you, Giovanni. So I'd just take you back to the September 2020 Critical Raw Materials Action Plan again briefly, where we're trying to combine security of supply for the European economy with a much stronger focus on ensuring that we're resource efficient, we're circular, we're sustainable, we're responsible and ethical wherever the raw materials come from. And diversification is one of the key concepts, and that can mean doing more domestically to reduce the amount of dependence externally. It can mean diversification away from critical raw materials by using substitution, but it can also mean diversifying away from single over-concentrated sources of supply to a broader spectrum of third country suppliers. And it's in that context that we have an action which talks about developing strategic partnerships with resource-rich countries with the perspective of engaging Europe with the partner country around the critical raw material and raw material more generally value chain. So it's not just about accessing ores and bringing them to Europe. It's a much richer kind of value proposition. We have already put in place a strategic partnership with Canada, and we also put in place one with Ukraine. So what you have there is, first of all, a relationship with a very like-minded Western world industrialized economy, which gives a lot of pays a lot of attention to sustainability and responsible mining. And then you have a country in Europe's neighborhood, which we want to help to turn towards the European Union and integrate its economy, particularly with all the external threats that Ukraine unfortunately faces. We're also looking more widely in the region, particularly at the Western Balkans. But as we also said in this part of the action plan, we're looking very much at Latin America, which is the subject of a dedicated partnership set of meetings next week, and at the African continent. Now, we're very conscious that there's a long history of the Western world going into African countries, and it's not always been a happy experience for African countries. We're fully aware of that. But equally, the more recent experience of many African countries is also not exactly a bed of roses. There's a lot of what some of the NGOs call extractivism. And we think that a number of African countries may well be interested in a new kind of partnership with the European Union, which is one which can offer mutual benefits. So certainly the European Union would like to secure supplies of critical raw materials and other raw materials, but we would also like to make sure that the extraction and processing is done to the kind of high environmental, social and governance standards that we need in Europe, and that we can help countries to develop both those higher standards, develop also the skills and the capacities necessary, but also to keep more value in country. I think that's a very important part of the proposal that we have. At the moment, we're doing some scoping work, and we're identifying a small number of countries where we would like to propose a start. I can't really name those countries here today. And we will be taking this forward in the next few months, and hopefully we'll be able to say something at the EU-Africa Summit, which is in February, and in parallel to which we will have an EU-Africa Business Forum with a high-level event around the integration of our respective value chains. Our strategic partnerships with African countries will look at the whole value chain. For example, we think that exploration is very patchy. Some African countries have a very good knowledge of what they've got in their rocks. Others do not. So we think that the expertise that we have in European geological surveys and also our Earth observation tools like Copernicus, we can help African countries, first of all, to develop a much better knowledge of their resources and reserves, and also then start to help investing in getting some projects off the ground. We also hope that by bringing in our industrial alliances on raw materials and batteries, we can bring in a wide spectrum of European companies and other stakeholders that can be interested in investing in these projects. And we can also bring in the supply of mining and processing equipment so that we can help modernize the way things are done. But beyond the pure raw materials, I think the interesting thing is that we can offer a broader spectrum of tools. First of all, we would like to go in together with the member states so that we have, if you like, a collective pooling of Europe's needs and capacity to offer something to African countries. And I think also we've got a wide variety of areas of policy interest where there is a connection. So we might be helping an African country, for example, to modernize its energy system, moving away from fossil fuels or use of wood to renewable energy, and that renewable energy can maybe be used as a way to reduce the climate footprint of mining and processing activities, or again, helping with developing infrastructure, hard infrastructure, digital infrastructure, and these kind of things. We will be paying particular attention to bringing together our mutual understanding of environmental, social, and governance criteria, and this will go hand in hand with some of the work that you'll hear about from my colleague from DG INTPA. We will, in a few weeks' time, be coming forward with a proposal on the Global Gateway, so there's very little I can say about it now, apart from reminding you that when President von der Leyen announced this concept in her State of the Union speech, she was talking very much about a new way of connecting with the rest of the world. This is part of the Geopolitical Commission approach. The idea being that there is an alternative to the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, one which may be more attractive to the kind of countries that we wish to develop a global gateway partnership with. I think I don't really need to say any more than that right now. So just to remind you that we're going to be contacting a number of African countries in the coming weeks and months, and we will be taking this further forward at the EU-Africa Summit next February and at the Business Forum in parallel. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter, and it's obviously a pleasure that you're presenting here today, and our units have interacted very closely over many years on these topics. We had one question, but I believe that you've basically addressed this, and that's looking at how China is really investing heavily in substantial infrastructure and so forth in Africa and other regions, and how is the EU expecting to respond to that and establish similar partnerships? I believe that you've answered this. I don't know if you want to add anything further on that. You've also highlighted the the Gateway, the Global Gateway Initiative that's going to come up later next year, I believe. Do you want to add a few more points there? Or?
Well, just to say that for some years now, China has been investing very heavily in the African continent, both in the metals and minerals space, but also in using African land mass to grow food for Chinese consumption, right? It's kind of externalizing the way that you provide the resources to the country that needs them. And that model has not really worked terribly well for a number of African countries because it's led them into debt. It's led them into having infrastructure which may have been built with not very open procurement processes, often built with a very high carbon intensity and environmental pollution. And things like ports being built, which then, if the country cannot pay a debt, become the property, or parts of the territory of the country become a property of China. This is not the way the European Union operates. This is not our value set, okay? So we want to take that European value framework into our discussions with these African countries, and we know that those countries that have got raw materials want to use that as the base for developing a healthy, robust, and more equitable society in their own countries, and we think we can help them do that.
Thank you very much, Peter. Our next speaker, who's quite well known to me, is Constantine Chupajaya, and he's the head of unit for the... okay, we have a question from the floor before I move on.
Thank you very much. I don't use Slido. Let's also, if I may ask a question and challenge a bit. My name is Piotr Barczak from the European Environmental Bureau. The two speakers told us about the scarcity, the problem that we will face if we don't change our economies. I want to ask a question. When you, in your household, when you know that water will be scarce or electricity will be expensive, what do? Are you trying to secure the resources coming to your house from elsewhere, even on the expenses of others? Or you try to tell to your family members, reduce your consumption. Let's change the equipment. Let's change our behavior. And what we are seeing here, we are trying again to look into other continents to secure our overconsumption of materials and resources. Our lifestyle, European lifestyle, which is much more impactful on the environment and society than Africans or other countries. Today, nothing was said. There was a lot of talk about horizontal approach, 360 analysis, analyzing the gaps. But the main gap, which is missing here, is the analysis of our overconsumption of resources in Europe. And this was not expressed today as one of the solutions. We want to still extract and extract and extract. Is it the way forward? I think that the strategy must look at making Europe resilient and reduce our dependence on materials that we will use in our electronics and so on, or cars. There are different ways to commute, to have mobility systems, not to have so many cars, even if, yes, we support the diversion from fossil fuels. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm happy to take that. I think it's an extremely valid point, and I'm sorry if I failed to address that in my remarks. Look, if we're honest, Europe is claiming moral leadership on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and it's doing a fair job in terms of reducing the emissions from what is produced in Europe. But that's only half the picture, because actually we've outsourced a lot of our emissions to the rest of the world, right? So it's all the products we bring in from China or from any other country around the world. You have to add it up to get the total picture, and actually it shows that our resource use per citizen is very high in Europe. It's not as high as the United States, right? But it's still typical Western world standards of consumption. So yeah, we do need to rethink the consumption patterns, and it has to come from a societal end, and it can't be left to every individual to shave a little bit off here and there by having one shower less a week, right? I understand that. And this does carry across into the raw materials side. I don't think any of us believe, certainly in the public policy sphere, that you can just carry on consuming what's in the ground at the same rate we have in the past. It makes no sense. We will just be piling up pollution and things like that. So we have to really reduce to the minimum what we need to take out of the ground, because we will need to take something out of the ground, but we really have to focus on changing the economic models that today force us into replacing mobile telephones every 3 or 4 years, or cars every 5 or 6, when these objects actually have a lifetime many times that. So, this is where our circular economy comes in to some extent, and other tools as well.
Thank you, Peter. I think that also touches on what Giovanni mentioned in terms of the sustainability regulations and the life cycle approach, and thinking about these and resource efficiency issues and so forth that we're not necessarily focusing on today, but it also touches on circularity, of course, repair, recycle, and reuse. So that's all in there. Given the timing, I'd like to move on to our next speaker. So this is Constantine Chupajaya, who is the head of unit from the land resources from the Directorate on Sustainable Resources. And Constantine will explain to us a little bit about the raw materials information system, and particularly, well, it's across the whole RMIS, the recently developed African country profiles. Before you speak though, Constantine, I would really like to say another thank you. So there's going to be lots of thank yous throughout this whole presentation, I'm afraid. But thank you, of course, to the team at the Joint Research Center, so Simone Manfredi, to Tamas Hamna, to Eleonora De Lilia, and Fabrice Mathieu, who have been supporting in the background this preparation, and who will also produce from this session and from all the inputs of the different speakers a kind of a little summary report with some overall findings on what are the knowledge needs, what are the gaps, what's the current situation, and how we move ahead in terms of EU and Africa focus. So with that, I pass over to Constantine.
Thank you. Hello, that's my pleasure after a quite tense period inside COVID, post-COVID, that we haven't seen each other. It was a real pleasure for me to see again in person many of our friends, stakeholders for the raw material European society and even global society, I would say. I'm happy that we are back forcefully. I am extremely grateful to our colleagues in DG GROW for this annual opportunity of sharing knowledge and supporting policies in Europe in the area of raw materials. And now, as it was just explained, even more so for strategic value chains, for autonomous supply chains, more autonomous supply chains, and so on. I would go on practically saying that in the last 2 years, we were finishing all the tasks that were inside a long collaboration and a very, hopefully, fruitful collaboration that we had with our colleagues in GROW, related to the EIP on raw materials, the European Innovation Partnership, related to the development of a raw material information system, and related to the support JRC was providing and is providing to many of the policies in these areas. We are, as I said, approaching the end, but what we did was, in the last 2 years, was a transition towards the new priorities of the European Union in this area of policy that is becoming, as it was mentioned in the previous days, more and more horizontal. And having said that, practically what we did, and I actually am showing in this slide some very important technical reports of the JRC on the raw material information system roadmap. We were discussing more and more with our policy DG partners in the Commission, where should we go with our knowledge information system on raw materials, non-fuel, non-food raw materials. And this roadmap of 2021 is practically a follow-up of several meetings that we had with our colleagues in many policy DGs, the representatives of which you will hear in our next session as well, many of them. I hope we are doing a good job. I hope that we are bettering on the side of managing this knowledge on raw materials for Europe. And I would say that the main pillars for us remain the new Circular Economy Action Plan that was launched in March 2020. It's obviously an enhanced follow-up of the first Circular Economy Action Plan. In that one, in 2015, the raw material information system was the first time mentioned. It got, let's say, the baptize in that moment. We continued to support the policies with this knowledge, and what we practically did, this was repeatedly presented throughout our publications, throughout our newsletters. I'm showing some of them here. Was practically to channel all this information, horizontal information, into an integrated manner towards the needs of EU in this vast area. The Circular Economy new action plan is one of the main building blocks of the EU Green Deal. Our Directorate, Giovanni mentioned it, is responsible in co-lead for supporting the Green Deal policies inside the European Commission, and is also responsible for supporting the priority on stronger Europe in the world that the Commission put forward. In both of these important priorities of our Commission, raw materials are really behind almost all the important documents. They are behind the issue of need of reducing the pressure on natural resources generally. They are behind the Sustainable Product Initiative. They are behind all the documents and all the actions that are focusing on the sectors which are mostly intensively using raw materials, critical raw materials, and where the potential for circularity is high, like electronic and ICT, batteries and vehicles, plastics, textiles, you know, all the strategic value chains that we know. They are essential in the new revision of the Framework Directive on Waste towards less waste production. They, going now to the other priority, they are very important in putting Europe on the global map where it should be. having the highest standards of climate, environmental, and labor protection, pushing for a strong, fair, and open trade agenda globally, introducing the comprehensive strategy on Africa, and this is why we are here today proposing this session and our new development. Also supporting the global efforts on circular economy, the partnership that were open, and we will hear today more about the Global Alliance on Circular Economy and Resource Efficiency. Practically, and I left it at the last, but it's definitely not the least important, it's supporting what is behind ensuring strategic autonomy as part of a common foreign and security policy for Europe. This is where I would say that our new development dedicated to African country profiles is heading mostly, because what we were trying to do is to bring together various needs coming from various policy partners that we have in the policy DGs that are looking at the development of partnership between European Union and African countries generally. And what we tried is to make more visible for the European consumer, but for the global consumer as well, throughout our raw material information system, the information that is available in a public way on African country, because our experience is that, yes, indeed, much of the information was there and is there all the time, but it is not integrated. It is not presented in a friendly way. It is not at disposal of somebody that will want to have it immediately in hand. So practically, we decided with our raw material information system, with that tile that is on the bottom row in the middle, to start proposing a kind of dynamic change with our newest application. So now you see there the African country profiles. This is our newest application. What we will intend to do in the future is, when we have a new dynamic application that is touching an important priority for the European policies, to bring it to attention in that tile. Obviously, African country profiles will go together with the EU country profiles, together with the general country profiles in one tile under country profiles. In this specific case, we put the priority on this tile. And having said that, practically, I am also mentioning very briefly the new development on the other important sector of our raw material information system, the raw material profiles, where again new development is under preparation. This is only a flavor of how it will look very soon, and it will be dedicated such a very brief knowledge presentation to each of the critical raw materials. Having said that, we have started to publish as well technical reports dedicated to each EU country profiles. You can find them inside the raw material information system, which I encourage you to navigate through. And in the end, I will leave it to a video that we will in which we try to show how to navigate in the new module dedicated to African country profiles. And before switching to this video that will be self-explanatory, I want to thank especially also to the team that put all their efforts for developing that. And these are Manuela Unguru, Bianca Bonolo, Eleonora Delia, she was mentioned already, and Simone Manfredi, and Elisa Garbosa and Theodor Chute for doing this for us. So thank you, and the video could practically go.
The JRC RMIS team is proud to launch the first version of the RMIS African country profiles. This video will only cover a selection from these profiles. We thus invite you to consult the RMIS to discover more. The country of interest can be selected by clicking on the African map or from the side menu. Each profile includes 7 thematic sections: quick facts, trade, trade measures, investments, governance and social responsibility, environment, and circular economy and resource efficiency. The first section, quick facts, shows the contribution of mining to the country's economy and the raw materials produced that are most relevant at global scale. The trade section gives access to the country's non-food, non-energy raw materials export data. Users can view exports by destination or by commodity. At any time, one can increase the level of detail or decrease it. It is possible to filter only critical raw materials and exports to the EU. Users can also see for which raw materials the country has the highest share in European imports. In the section called Trade Measures, users can explore the regional trade agreements signed by the African country. The right-hand side displays the existing trade agreements, the left-hand side the signatory countries, and a click on a trade agreement's name will open its specific web page. Under the section Investments, the evolution of the exploration budget over time gives an overview of the materials that are explored for. Data about the active mining companies are also included, as well as their projects. The Governance and Social Responsibility section includes key indicators like the Natural Resource Governance Index and the risk of humanitarian crises and disasters, and their components. It shows official employment in mining and estimates about the people working in artisanal and small-scale mining. Coming soon, the Environment section will feature an interactive map viewer in which users can display the mining locations, both active and inactive, and overlay the relevant environmental data by selecting or deselecting the layers. For example, protected areas or forest loss. There is also a time series of emissions by raw material sector. The section called Circular Economy and Resource Efficiency shows the generation of overall municipal waste and of e-waste. It is also possible to view and filter the types of waste and secondary raw materials that are traded, and the partner regions. Thank you for your attention. We invite you to have a full look at the African country profiles at the RMIS website. And stay tuned for new developments and updates.
Just at the end, two more short things. The fact is that we will continue indeed to update you, and this module that you have just seen presented is available since yesterday practically for navigation. So we really invite you to do it and to see its facilities. In the next months and years, we will, as explained, go on with more development on the critical raw material profile side, and also in support of what one of the speakers yesterday mentioned very clearly, that we should not discriminate on any of the sections of the life cycle of all the value chains related to raw materials. And we make this one of our big challenges, to look at all the sections in the value chains of raw materials. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Constantine, for this overview of quite an impressive system in terms of the African country profiles. Thank you also for thanking the team, so you saved me a little bit of time on that. So obviously this can all be found, as Constantine highlights, online already as of yesterday on the Raw Materials Information System. Before we have a break, I would like to announce our next speaker in this opening session, and that is Fred Kabanda, who is kindly joining us online, I hope, from the African Development Bank and also the African Natural Resources Center. And he's really going to show us some insights and tell us a little bit about what's going on in Africa in terms of the role of knowledge in the Africa's mineral development. And looking from the point of view from the African Development Bank, what's the current situation, what are some of the gaps, and what's the future? So Fred, if you're hopefully online somewhere. We have a slight technical fault because Fred was online, but it's just lost the connection. So we wait a few minutes. Should we go to the break? We could go to the break now and then try to recess. Yeah, I think we can shift slightly to move to the break now, and if we can come back early, is that fitting? 15 minutes. Try to come back to the room at 3:15, please. We will start at 3:15 instead of 3:30, so we take the break now, if that's feasible with the organizers as well. And then we will try to have Fred online shortly after the break. So 3:15, slightly earlier, back in the room, please. Thank you. Okay, thank you. Welcome back, everybody, to this second part of this session on knowledge needs with a EU-Africa focus. Hopefully we have Fred Kabanda online now to talk to us from the African Development Bank and the African National Resources Center. Fred, are you there this time? Great. Hi, Fred.
Yes, I am. Apologies for my breaking of the rhythm with the poor network I had. I have a few slides I would like to just take you through, but before that, I would like to thank you very much, the organizers, for inviting the African Development Bank to talk about the role of knowledge in maximizing Africa's mineral development, our own perspective. What I will do is briefly speak about the constraints in using the critical minerals for Africa, and then the role of knowledge in positioning Africa better. Now, I'll first set the stage by talking about the African Development Bank and what we do, very briefly. The next slide, please. The African Development Bank delivers on two main objectives. One, financial services, and two, technical support for mainly transformative projects that will be able to reduce on poverty for Africa. And we do this through inclusive growth, but also looking at aspects that transition to green economies. Now, overall, globally, what we have seen is that the transition to green energy has brought out an increase in electric vehicles, in battery storage systems, and green energy investments, mainly in solar and wind. We think this creates an opportunity for developing the critical mineral value chains in Africa. It is therefore for this reason that we at the African Development Bank undertook certain studies in order to assess the opportunities and challenges of using African minerals to go a step further into the value chains and create industrialization using these resources. Next slide, please. And Africa is basically endued with many mineral resources. And the Africa green minerals that are significant include cobalt, which is, in terms of global reserves, is about 52%. Bauxite for aluminium, the reserves are about 25%. Graphite, 21%. And manganese, the production, this is only the production that is currently about 80%. And so, borrowing from this chart, which was produced by Bloomberg, we identify the critical minerals that are indeed significant. And we used this in order to analyze the battery value chain. Next, please. Next slide, please. The lithium battery value chain, and analyzed what is the value in each of the segments of the value chain. And in 2019, using a battery price of about $416 per kilowatt hour, we found that the raw materials contribute only 12%, but when you go into processing, it is about 28% contribution to the total cost, and 35% if you went into the cell manufacturing. So basically, we are now analyzing what are the key issues in the supply chains that affect one from going, or stop one from going to the next phase. And we realized that actually one of the main factors is that you have to be near a market in order to be able to produce on these other aspects. In the next slide, I look at the value creation. And when we look at the market value in 2025 for battery supply chains, the mining sector contributes 11 billion. But when you go into smelting and refining of lithium, nickel, and cobalt, the value increases to 44 billion. And when you go into precursor production, the value increases to 271 billion. And this goes on until electric vehicles, whose estimated cost in 2025 will be over 7 trillion. And this brought questions in our mind as to how can we position better Africa in terms of using its critical minerals. And in the next slide, what we did was to ask Bloomberg for us to map for us the battery manufacturing plans and expectations going forward. And so in this map, the green color shows the fully commissioned battery plants. The yellow is those that are under construction, while the brown is those that have announced intentions in order to build these plants. Two observations from this map. One is that Africa is missing in this value creation. But above all, even the low-hanging fruits of using the 2- and 3-wheeler motorized transportation is not considered in the future of battery manufacturing. And two, the second observation is that the supply chain actually is increasing emissions, especially due to transport. And we looked at graphite, for instance, which was moving from Mozambique to China, a distance of 10,900 kilometers. And out of this, 500 is by road. Cobalt, similarly, moves from Congo to China, a total of about 17,000 kilometers. Out of this, 2,500 is by road. And so in our latest study, which we will be publishing soon together with our partners, we have analyzed what could happen if precursors were actually manufactured in Africa and exported elsewhere using clean grid energy from hydro and other clean sources. We have found that actually the total emissions would reduce by 20% overall. And this is something that we think is a good way forward. Now, next slide, I look at the constraints of using the critical minerals for Africa's development. And in this slide, what I have done is we mapped out the different components that would make a complete battery manufacture using aspects of the equipment, land that is required, supporting facilities. And what we realized is there are constraints that relate to, one, the economies of scale, and therefore the need for us to have geoscientific knowledge of the reserves and resources. Basically, there is under exploration in Africa, and so the small discoveries that are made are thought not to be that big, even when they could actually be big enough. In other words, the planning is affected using partial information that comes from the geology. The second challenge we see is investment costs are in billions of dollars, which is difficult to get on our own at once. The third factor is the China factor, and this is mainly because of the competition in terms of production, but the advantage they have is the large domestic battery demand due to the population. And this is something that we also need to look at. But in addition, the skills are inadequate for us, especially in the downstream aspects, in order to be able to actually concentrate on these. The constraints continued in the next slide. We talk about the price uncertainties and changes in battery composition between lithium, cobalt, and other components of nickel, manganese, and so on, which are actually being, which is evolving. We now know that the nickel, manganese, cobalt battery chemistry is predominant, but even that, the ratios are changing, and this affects the market prices for the different elements. There is also a low demand for electric vehicle production in Africa as of now, and this is also a challenge. The other factor is the ESG, the environmental social governance aspects, especially where we have child labor and environmental issues, especially in the DR Congo, which produces most of the cobalt. The final constraint, which is also a plus that we see, is that rare earth elements market is mainly controlled in China. But this is also an opportunity because looking at the major consumers, we see a trend of being able to look at what are the alternative supply chains beyond China and being able to look at reliability and supply predictability going forward. And this is an area where we think Africa is actually an alternative source for rare earth elements. And this presents an opportunity for value chain development. Now, before I conclude, I would like to look at the role of knowledge. Having said all this, in other words, the resources there, we see the constraints. How does knowledge come in? Knowledge comes in the aspect of knowing what resources you have, and among these, it can help you to plan. I have talked about this, and the preliminary evaluation of the different potential areas, we see that there could be about 3 hubs in Africa for being able to at least process the raw materials to the next stage. But even if we went into this, there is need to create partnerships and joint ventures, especially with large-scale mining companies, with refiners, with cathode manufacturers, and with battery manufacturers in order to borrow technology and bring in capital in order to see how to take this forward. Battery research is critical, and because of technological advances, there is indeed no need for battery research. And this is knowledge that can also be looked at going forward, such that we do not set up battery plants that are going to be redundant in the next 5 or so years because of change of battery chemistries. Improvement in investment climate is critical in terms of what infrastructure is required and what skills could actually be focused on in order to look forward and look at what is next. A regional strategy is something we have been looking at together with our partners, the AU, UNECA, and many other institutions in Africa, on if the minerals for battery manufacturing are not possible to be found in one country, how can we come as a region in order to be able to look at the strategy of developing these? And this is where we look at the green minerals strategy. In all I have said, it could be theoretical and it could be a wish until we do a feasibility study. And so there is actually a need to do economic evaluation of what is possible and what is not possible through feasibility studies, and look at the aspects of how will you be able to finance this. The domestic investments, are they enough, or do you have to look at external? And in terms of market, we have got an advantage currently of the Africa continental free trade area, which is something that could be used as an entry point. In conclusion, therefore, in my last slide, we see that Africa has significant battery minerals, and all these fit into the different lithium-ion battery chemistries. We also see that the continental free trade area I talked about, together with the lessons we learned from COVID-19 supply chain blockages, could actually create a market, an inward-looking market that could be used to induce trade development within Africa. In all this, governments and regional bodies have a role to play. Governments first must be able to generate the prerequisite geoscientific information, at least the preliminary, in order to use that to attract for investment. But the second is enhancing global collaboration is necessary in order to promote joint project development. So basically, what we see is that the recipe for Africa value chain development is in threefold. One, sustainable extraction of the raw materials, attraction of investment for battery manufacturing, and creating demand for electric vehicles and battery energy storage systems within Africa. And this we can only do with knowledge. Knowledge is key in doing this, and it could be able to actually let us know through knowledge what resources exist, what development strategies can be used, and conducting of feasibility studies will also be necessary to establish any battery manufacturing or any refineries or any precursor industries and battery assembling in addition to these. Promoting a regional approach for development of the EV value chains is critical, but above all these, strategies for financing these wishes is critical, and we can only do this through both the local pension and insurance funds, but also partnerships with external stakeholders like the EU and many others. In my very last slide, I would like to invite you to a meeting next week on DRC Africa Business Forum 2021, where the government, together with the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, the African Development Bank, and many other stakeholders are all looking at how can we develop the battery industry and be able to at least produce the precursor batteries and produce for the local market and export the extra or the excess to other parts of the world. I thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity you have given us to highlight these things. Thank you.
Thank you to you, Fred, for this very interesting presentation and a real good insight into a lot of the mutual interests for further development and investment in Africa, and reasons why we should increase, let's say, shifting value chains into Africa themselves to reduce also emissions and so forth, and enhance diversification. So I think that's very interesting. Thank you very much, Fred. Building from this and going directly to the next speaker, I'd like to introduce Carsten Sorensen, who is from DG INPA, and he's Deputy Head of Unit for the Private Sector and Trade. And Carsten is going to give us a little bit of an introduction and insight into a very related topic that builds nicely, I think, from Fred's presentation. How we're going to support more the development of raw material sustainable value chains with our African partners from the Commission's perspective. So Carsten.
Hello? Yeah, that one. Thank you very much for giving me the floor, and it's indeed a big pleasure to be able to explain a little bit what we are trying to do in the Directorate General for International Partnerships, where we put in a lot of efforts not to work in a vacuum, and not to work in a silo, but to do what we're doing together with our colleagues. Some of them are here from the JSC, from DG Grow, from DG Trade. So we are trying to be the part of the puzzle that looks at this topic from a international partnerships angle. I will not start by using the most terrible sentence you can start an intervention with by saying I will be short, because then it normally drags on forever. So very briefly still, I'll try to outline the policy and the political context in which we work, give some examples of tools that we use, and try and explain how we see the next steps and on what exactly our intervention will be based in future, and how we see this play into the bigger picture. First of all, when you look at the policy context, there's obviously the geopolitical aspect. We are straight out of COP26, on which everybody is debating whether the glass was half full or half empty. But still, this is one of the texts and one of the outcomes we have to work with, and I think it gives sufficient room to build a policy on raw materials that is sustainable and respectful, both for those who extract it, for those who trade it, and for the environment when it's being processed. One of the leitmotifs of the current European Commission is the Green Deal, and what we're doing obviously has to fit in to our efforts to be fit for 55, to reduce our carbon footprint, to produce and consume in a sustainable way, and there have been very interesting exchanges on that before. So that's where we situate, or the wider context in which we situate what we're doing. Obviously, carbon neutrality is one of the buzzwords. And what Fred just said is indeed extremely interesting, and it links also very well up with what Constantine mentioned about cobalt, for example. If you look at it from a sort of decent work perspective, estimates say that between 20 and 30% of cobalt that is used in global production of batteries in particular is extracted by small-scale miners. Who says small-scale miners says very often work outside of occupational health and safety conditions, and at times also forced labor and other similar forms. So this is something we are trying to help our partner countries address. This falls into the aspect of human rights, which for us are as important as environmental sustainability. And another aspect which is often neglected, I think, in the public discourse, is the difficulties of managing revenues. This is an area where we try to help partner countries who so wish to manage the inflow of funds or the steep increase in revenue that often goes along with mining, and how to transform this into a more sustainable domestic revenue mobilization and contribute to the wider development of the country. I forgot to. Yeah, here come some examples. The print is probably too small, but I'm very happy to leave the PowerPoint presentation with the organizers, of course, and so that can be distributed to all of you. I would like to give two sorts of examples. One is the capacity building, and the other one is transparency. So two angles through which we try and intervene. One aspect of capacity building is a program we run together with colleagues from Germany, the Netherlands, and France. It's called the European Partnership for Responsible Minerals, and which promotes responsible sourcing, and this particularly in fragile and conflict prone areas. And it's part of the accompanying measures that are there to support both upstream and downstream the conflict minerals regulation. And just as a sort of parenthesis, this is what we usually try and do in the Commission, is when regulations are set up in parallel to look at, or at the same time to look at possible drawbacks, at possible difficulties that could result from them, and address them through accompanying measures. And that is one such example. You will find more in regulation or around regulations that are currently being developed, which may have an impact also on the area we're talking about, like the social corporate governance. We don't know yet what exact legislative form it will take, but let's say initiative that is coming up. A second capacity building example we have is the Development Minerals Program that we run together with the ACP. And this has the objective of developing skills and an institutional capacity to deal with raw materials and mining. Transparency is a crucial ingredient, I would say, for decent work, human rights, and protecting the population. The Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative is such an attempt, where on the international, it's on international scale, where we promote disclosure of information along the value chain, which indeed is quite efficient in pushing actors to lay open the entire revenues that are derived from this work. 55 members does it count, of which 27 are from Africa. So that's quite an important initiative. And one area which I personally find particularly interesting and rewarding, it's what we call CONNEX. It's a G7 initiative sponsored mainly by Germany and by us. It's an initiative through which we provide highly specialized expertise to countries who are negotiating contracts in the area of mining. That can be in financial, fiscal, or legal areas, because very often when you're sitting there and have to write the fine print as well, it's very important that you have specialists who know exactly the ins and outs and possible pitfalls, and that's where we try and be helpful to partner countries who think this is interesting. The way forward, or the way we try and build these programs and our help are all anchored in our financial instrument, in our budgetary instrument, which had an awful name, NDICI, which everybody pronounced in a different way. So it was decided that it would be called Global Europe, which is indeed much easier. And among the many new features in that way of funding is that we will focus on countries. So what we are looking at is to make a difference at the country level by pooling forces, by pooling resources, by pooling expertise at the level of a certain country. So avoiding spreading things too thin, and rather go into a specific area where we think help can be, and assistance and cooperation in particular, can be particularly efficient, which means that the most important actor from the Commission are actually not us guys sitting here in headquarters, but our eyes and ears and hands and brains on the ground in the delegation. So we are moving towards a much stronger implication of our delegations, and that's what we tell all our partners, that the first point of contact should always be the delegation in the respective country. And if I may just add one element to conclude, which could be of interest to some of you, is around the African Union, European Union political summit that I think Peter mentioned at the start, which takes place sometime in February, probably in the coming year. The week before, there will be an EU-Africa business forum, which is a high-level networking event with conferences like the one we are having now, with workshops, with virtual marketplaces, with ministers intervening, etc. And one of the focal themes, or the general focal theme, is around value chains. And one of the main elements we'll be looking at is raw material. So that could be another point of interest for all of us here, to meet up together with a wider crowd, where we are hopeful that half of participants would come from the African continent. That's sort of the publicity I would like to make at the end of my intervention, and thank you all very, very much for your attention. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you very much, Carsten. Okay, I think we'll jump, unless there's any questions in the audience, we'll jump directly to our next presentation, which is from De Gaulle Haulu from United Nations Development Programme, again online. So De Gaulle is going to give us a little bit of an insight into the bridging of the knowledge gaps in relation to raw materials value chains. And here, like earlier, we saw a little bit on the batteries value chains. Here we're going to have a little bit of a focus on the case of clean energy sources. So hopefully, De Gaulle, do we have you online?
Yes, you do.
Fantastic.
Can you hear me?
Yes, and we can see you. Excellent. Oh, you've disappeared. Can we bring back De Gaulle, please? Fantastic, you're there again. We don't hear you at the moment. De Gaulle, we don't have sound for you. Okay, we have again another slight technical hitch. We're just missing the sound from De Gaulle. So I'm not sure if it's from our side or from your side if you're muted. No. I think we've lost De Gaulle now. Unfortunately, we don't have any more breaks to go to, so we'll just give a few seconds and then maybe we try to move
than fossil fuel-based technologies. So the more the world moves into clean energy production, the more energy is required. Therefore, there will be an intensity or a pressure to engage in smart mining. So that's the context I would like to share with you. Another is the demand for minerals that are inputs to clean energy is expected to shoot up significantly. For example, the demand for copper for the next 30 years is estimated to grow by 450%. The demand for lithium by 55%. The demand from nickel, for example, it's 200%, and cobalt by 25%. In a nutshell, over 3 billion tons of critical minerals will be needed in the next 3 decades. So what does this mean? What is the implication of this rising demand to the value chain? What happens across the value chain? In this case, I'm talking about 4 stages of the value chain. It's production, it's processing, it's distribution and use. So what are the implications along this value chain of this increasing demand? So let's start with the good news first. The good news is that African countries will have the opportunity once again to generate tax revenues and foreign exchange from trading and exporting these new critical minerals. They will be able to mobilize the much needed development finance, for example, to accelerate the meeting of the Sustainable Development Goals. Another good news is African economies will have the chance to embark on diversification, domestic processing, and value addition, generate again employment and income. So those are the good news of the clean energy transition. They will also
excuse me, Mr. Hailu. I don't know if you spotted the message that we received in the chat. There is a message from the organizer referring to a technical problem, visibly.
My camera is on. My camera is on. You cannot see me?
I think we can. I am another speaker, and I can hear you and I can see you, but there's a message from the organizer in the chat function in Teams saying that there was a technical problem and they ask you to start all over again, if I understand correctly.
Okay.
Maybe there is someone else that can come in this chat and this meeting to instruct Mr. Hailu about how to go about.
Oh, you want me to start from the beginning?
Well, I'm just sharing with you the information that was conveyed in the chat.
Hello, De Gaulle. Do you hear me? Thanks for that intervention, Martin.
I don't know if David or one of the organizers could guide Mr. Hailu on how to proceed.
No, I think we had a slight technical fault at the start, but I think we're back on track now. And,
I'm waiting for the guidance.
Yep.
We can't hear you, David. You're speaking, but it's on mute on our side.
Okay. Can you hear me online now?
I cannot hear the speaker on the platform. I think the technical issue is on your side.
Okay, do you hear me now?
But just to be clear, I'm one of the subsequent speakers from the Commission here, and I don't have a problem. I hear you, and I've been able to follow, but I'm just conveying to you the message that was placed in the chat from the organizers. And they refer to a technical problem and ask you to start all over. But I think we would need some maybe further guidance from David or one of the organizers before.
Martin, do you hear me?
Yes, we hear. Now we hear.
Now we can
Fantastic. Yes, please continue. The technical problem was solved, and actually we got most of the presentation of De Gaulle. So I don't think it's a good idea to start. So De Gaulle, if you can continue from where you were, and then maybe when you summarize at the end, just go over everything in a summarized manner. But I think we need to carry on schedule as well. But thanks very much, Martin, for the intervention. So if we can switch back to De Gaulle now, if that's possible, and we continue De Gaulle's presentation, please. Thank you.
So can I continue now? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, so thank you very much. So I was just at the point where I was explaining the increasing demand for critical minerals and the energy transition presents African economies the opportunity to exploit in terms of generating employment, income, and so forth. And lastly, in terms of building the vital infrastructures related to the mineral sectors in terms of roads, rates, and ports. But however, there is a key knowledge gap here. So are we transferring the burden of the energy transition on Africans in terms of the economic, environmental, and social impacts? So I think that's where most of the knowledge gap exists. In terms of the economics, for example, is there really knowledge, full knowledge, in terms of the capacity, skills, and know-how among African economies to add value and process these new minerals? I mean, do we really have extensive studies on that? There is limited knowledge there. Or in other words, are African policymakers able to adopt and diffuse technologies related to critical minerals? Again, I think you can see the processing of these critical minerals along the value chain is dominated by China, the European Union, the United States, and some other Asian countries like Indonesia and so forth. So in terms of knowledge, how much do we know, the possibility, the know-how, the skills, whether those things exist within the continent? To what extent do they exist, and how, to what extent we can leverage on them? Or the other issue is, are these developed economies, or including China and the United States, European Union, are these countries prepared to transfer knowledge to the African economies so that the African economies build the necessary linkages? So what is the transfer of knowledge and diffusion? What is the current state of technology transfer globally as it relates to critical minerals? The other issue is, what are the policy measures needed to incentivize, for example, multinational companies, some private companies, to employ, or to remove technological barriers for recycling and reuse? I think, given the scarcity as we go forward, and given limited geological knowledge we have, I think recycling and reusing of minerals is important. So one knowledge area we have limited know-how is really, where are we in terms of recycling and reusing of these critical minerals? The other area is really, what kind of global economic cooperation is now needed to avoid price volatility? As you know, the traditional metals and minerals for the past many decades suffered from commodity price volatility. So are we entering into another phase of price volatility? Do we have really the mitigation measures in terms of the critical minerals and going forward? Especially if you look at lithium, graphite, cobalt, and others, they're very much specific technologies. They are used in one or two applications. Therefore, there is always demand uncertainty. So how do you ensure that demand uncertainty is removed? The other issue is, production supply is very much concentrated. China, Australia, Indonesia are the top three. And if you add a few more countries, I think there are only 10 countries which really dominate the production of these critical minerals globally. So what does it mean really to price? The price means determined outside of the African continent. So how do you resolve that price domination and potential commodity price fluctuations? So that volatility is important to avert, because companies and governments in times of volatility will seek shortcuts and neglect social and environmental safeguards. So another knowledge area, I think, where we need to do more work is production and processing of critical minerals themselves can be a source of greenhouse emissions. That's what I said in my opening remarks. Actually, these minerals require more energy to produce per unit of production compared to oil and gas. So to what extent is smart mining implemented in Africa? We have limited knowledge of that. So that's one area we could explore. In terms of the environment, production and processing of critical minerals can alter land use. That has been the case in many of the, if you look at, for example, the case studies coming out of DRC. So are there adequate safeguards in place among environmental agencies, ministries of environment, to protect biodiversity, ecosystem services, and tackle soil erosion and water contamination and so forth? Again, the minerals that mainly go into clean energy production, as explained by other presenters here, are also exposed to waste management issues in terms of acid drainage, water discharge, how do you deal with tailings, for example, remnants after the mining, how do you deal with disposals, and so these are issues, again, very new to the African continent, and then it's likely to intensify. I think knowledge in this area is relevant as well. In terms of the social issues, again, you can see what level of capacity is there really to avoid what we experienced in terms of changes in community life, displacements, excessive migration, poor working conditions, hazardous workplace issues like chemical use and so forth. These are also, the increasing demand for these minerals will expose countries in this area. In terms of governance, how do we strengthen the systems that urge companies to report on their sustainability metrics? Most companies have, voluntarily report on their sustainability measures, and there are good initiatives globally, like the Energy Resource Governance Initiative or the OECD's Responsible Business Conduct. But other initiatives like the European Battery Alliance or the European Raw Materials Alliance emphasize only on security of supply. But I think we should have more knowledge on how we can shift these initiatives to also focus on sustainability and responsible sourcing going forward. So, just to conclude, what are the suggestions to fill all those knowledge gaps I talked about? I think the previous speaker mentioned the ACP EU Development Minerals Program, which is a tripartite partnership between the UNDP, the European Commission, and the OACPS. I think that program has been implemented since 2015 and accumulated enough knowledge on how to support and strengthen the small-scale mining industry. Although that program focuses on development minerals, I think there is an opportunity to leverage that program and carry out a series of value chain analysis, for example, to gauge more effectively who benefits and suffers from the burden of the risks of this renewable transition. The analysis can be done by commodity, by country, to come up with specific recommendations. What I'm getting at is really there is an existing partnership with the European Commission, with UNDP and the OACPS, which we can leverage to carry out more studies on the risks and burdens involved in the clean energy transition. The second, I think, suggestion is we also need really to look at how we can support the revision of the African Mining Vision. As you know, the African Mining Vision is a document which was produced by the African heads of states about 11 years ago. It is really a blueprint, giving a guiding principle for the governance of the mining sector in Africa. But the vision is very old now, 11 years. Since then, the Paris Agreement happened, and now the Glasgow Pact has taken on. Sustainable development goals were introduced since then. The world has changed, so it would be helpful to look into how we can support the African Union revise the African mining vision and to reflect, the clean energy transition, and then set really the principles there. So in conclusion, I think we need knowledge to help us strike the balance between our growing demand for critical minerals and the need for a new resource governance model that benefits Africa. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, De Gaulle, for this very comprehensive overview, this nice outline of the knowledge situation and needs, including the necessity to transfer knowledge to Africa, issues such as smart mining, and also the environmental waste dimensions as well as social considerations. I think very interesting as well that you gave very precise recommendations at the end that also from the Commission side that we should carefully look at in relation to the European Raw Materials Alliance and the Battery Alliance and other issues of how we can interact in terms of partnerships and so forth. So I think we will look at those also extremely carefully. Apologies for the technical problems, and thank you for colleagues for trying to intervene and help us with those. So hopefully now we move on to some more online presentations from Commission colleagues from DG Trade, and we have two presentations back-to-back, very brief ones, from Philippe Dupuis and from Martin Westrup. Is that correct still, Martin? Is the two of you online? We'll start with Martin, I believe, and Martin will give us a little bit of an overview in the context of trade agreements and raw material considerations, and now I see Philippe as well. And then Philippe will go a little bit into the conflict minerals regulation and responsible sourcing aspects. So Martin, I believe it's over to you first.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, David. And please accept also my apologies to Mr. Hailu for having interrupted him visibly without any good reasons. But we had a message that it was a technical problem, and I wanted to share that with you. But please do accept my apologies, Mr. Hailu. So yeah, thank you very much for inviting DG Trade again to the Raw Materials Week and this session. I understand that you already listened to our colleagues from DG Grow, and I also listened in. Just now to the colleagues from DG Inpa. So I just wanted to say that we are operating in the same context here, of course, and we are especially looking at the angle in relation to how we relate to third countries when it comes to, on the one side, satisfying our demand for raw materials, but also how we can ensure that there is a gradual integration of value chains between ourselves and our partner countries. And in that context, there's also the investment angle, of course, that is important for both us and countries like those in Africa. So in the broader context of the policies for raw materials that Peter Handley mentioned earlier on this afternoon, we are then focusing on one of the three pillars of the strategy, in addition to domestic sourcing and recycling. We are focusing on the aspects that it relates to how we can have sustainable and well-diversified supply of primary raw materials from third countries, but also linked, as I said, to the investment in those third countries, to the mutual benefit of all of us. Just very briefly, before I turn to Africa more specifically, what we are looking at from the trade perspective in this context is on the one side that we can ensure undistorted trade in these goods between us. So we're trying to push back on what would be distortive and unjustified export restrictions, for example, in this context, to ensure that there can be undistorted trade between parties. But we are also very keen to bring forward the aspects of responsible sourcing and sustainable sourcing in this context. And my colleague Philip will speak to this in a second, so I will not develop that further, but that is a very important priority also for DG Trade in this context. And then thirdly, the broader issue of diversifying supply and strengthening the partnerships with countries that we can trust and that we feel comfortable to rely on, also from a resilience and security perspective. So in this context, we work on the one side plurilaterally, including with the OECD. I see Tyler is also coming online, hopefully very soon on this. So good to see you again, Tyler, indeed. So we're working with the OECD on sustainable sourcing, but also in the context of keeping track of export restrictions in another team of the OECD. So big supporters of those work streams from the OECD, but also very much bilaterally, including with Africa, countries in Africa through trade negotiations, and also, if need be, a unilateral action to push back on distortions by certain economies when it comes to the fair trade of raw material. So on that backdrop, just on raw materials in Africa, I mean, I think all of us and that are speakers and the entire audience knows the importance of Africa in this context as a major producer, but also as a country or a continent with a lot of potential also to develop the processing industry and the value addition domestically. So for critical materials such as bauxite and cobalt and tantalum, iridium, platinum, rhodium, and I can go on. And Africa is the biggest producer and the biggest supplier for the European economy. So we have a very keen interest to strengthen the partnership with Africa in this regard, including through trade policy. So more specifically in Africa, we are trying to implement those work strands that I mentioned, the general work strands that I mentioned in the beginning, also with regard to Africa. So in the context of, for example, the OECD's work on export restrictions, we're giving quite a lot of attention to Africa. And this is sometimes a sensitive topic where some believe that export restrictions would be good tools to incentivize domestic investments, but we are there also to help our trading partners to rather focus on improving the general framework for investment conditions as the incentive for this investment. And we're also working together with the OECD in this regard to be clear that export restrictions are not effective tools to develop the domestic industry. And we have many examples that could be provided in this regard. But we do support those ambitions, and we're also there through our trade and investment negotiations to help our partners to improve the investment conditions and the climate for purposes of retaining and improving a value addition in the source countries. Before concluding, I should also note that we are in the context of agreeing on a new post-Cotonou agreement, of course, between the EU and big parts of Africa. And in that context, we have put additional emphasis on the extractive industries and the need to ensure responsible practices upstream and to improve transparency as well on these activities, while at the same time pushing back on distortions to trade and investment to the benefit of both the EU and Africa in this context. So it is really about trying to make sure that trade policy can feed into this broader picture that you have also seen listening to Peter and to the colleagues from INPE, and use our trade negotiations, our trade relationships, our trade policy to, on the one side, ensure fair and undistorted trade and investment between us, but also to achieve a gradual integration of the value chains between ourselves in Africa to the mutual benefit, both from an economic, geopolitical, and geopolitical perspective. So with this, I'd like to hand over to my colleague Philip. Unless David, by the way, I suppose that David may want to come in and give some introductory remarks before Philip takes the floor. I'm sorry about that.
David, do you want to say something? Otherwise, I kick off. Okay, I think I simply kick off. So good afternoon. Very happy to be with you. So I would like to complement what Martin has said and cover a little bit more let's say, the responsible sourcing angle on raw materials. Now, of course, this is a wide field, and there's a few pieces of legislation also in the pipeline in the Commission, the EU, which could cover due diligence, sustainability due diligence in the raw materials sector. But I would like to focus on one which is actually applied now, which is what is commonly called the conflict minerals regulation, or the responsible minerals regulation. I think the formal name is the regulation laying down supply chain due diligence obligations for union importers of tin, tantalum, tungsten, the ores, and gold originating from conflict-affected and high-risk areas. I think this title already gives the scope of that regulation. So, what do we call conflict-affected and high-risk areas? It's defined in the regulation. It's the areas in a state of armed conflict or fragile post-conflict, as well as areas witnessing weak or non-existing governance and security, such as failed states and widespread and systematic violations of international law, including human rights abuses. So that's the definition of conflict-affected and high-risk areas that we also abbreviate to CARAs. Now that's a little bit the context. So we have obligation on EU importers. We have coverage of tin, tungsten, tantalum, and gold. So this is the product coverage, and we have the source in conflict-affected and high-risk areas. Now this regulation entered into force in 2017. But actually went into full application only at the beginning of this year. So there was a kind of preparatory phase for its let's say its preparation, but it's really in full application since 1st of January of this year. And what does it mean? It simply means that EU importers of minerals and metals consisting of or containing tin, tungsten, tantalum, and gold will have to, from conflict-affected and high-risk areas, will have to follow the obligation of the conflict minerals regulation, so the due diligence obligations of the conflict minerals regulation, if the import volumes are above certain de minimis thresholds. So this is what it means. So it's relatively fresh in its implementation. It's too early for the moment to draw any conclusion on its effectiveness and how it works. On this substance, what is important here is that we very much align ourselves to the OECD. Hello, Tyler. We basically, the OECD guidance for minerals, metals and minerals from CARAs is a voluntary scheme. What we do with our regulation is that we make it mandatory for EU importers. Now, given that this is a supply chain due diligence, of course, this obligation of importers, for EU importers, then obviously trickles down along the supply chain via the smelters and refiners, traders to the source, and this materializes through the obligations that the for EU importers that the regulation foresees, aligned again to the OECD, so it will not be unknown to the practitioners of in the mineral value chain, so their management system obligations, risk management obligations, third-party audit obligations, and transparency obligations, and all these obligations, of course, entail obligations to bring down the management of the risks and the mitigation work down the supply chain. I think this is the essence of that regulation, and this then goes down to the source. Let's say the options then that this leaves for EU importers is when a product is sourced in conflict-affected and high-risk areas, if there is a risk identified, is either to continue to trade while trying to mitigate the risk, or to temporarily suspend trade while working on risk mitigation efforts, or the third possibility is to disengage with the supplier, either if there have been failed attempts on risk mitigation or where the EU importer deems mitigation not feasible or the risk unacceptable. Now, this, of course, this last option is what we absolutely want to avoid. What we want to achieve is trade with controlled and mitigated risks. I think this is the key thing, is to have a clean supply chain, but to continue to trade. I think this is the essential objective behind it. I leave it at that because the time is very short. Maybe just one little thing as well we have, which is of interest, of course, for you as participants. Concerning the CARAs, the Commission has worked also on support instruments, and one of the support instruments is a list of conflict-affected and high-risk areas, which has not been developed by the European Commission, but has been developed by experts, outside experts, which it's a list which is updated every 3 months on the basis of the methodology which has been predefined. This is there in order to help the users or the operators in order to work with the regulation. But it's important to know that an area or country which is on the list will be a CARA, so that means that the transaction falls under the regulation. If a region is not on the list, that doesn't simply disengage the company from its obligations. It will still have to make its own due diligence and check where the source is of the minerals or the metals, and ascertain that it is not conflict affected or in high risk area. I leave it at that. There's much more to say, but the time is short. But I think this is the essence, and I thank you very much for your attention. Thanks.
Okay, thank you to both Martin and Philippe for your interventions, for this overview of the trade considerations, the distortions, the export restrictions, and also then from Philippe to introducing us to where we are in terms of the conflict minerals regulation, and what is the current state of play, and really what we're trying to achieve with that. So leading naturally on from this, as was partly pointed, we have Tyler Gillard from the OECD, who is the head of due diligence. And Tyler will continue this same theme, looking at responsible sourcing, the knowledge needs, and also a little bit considering both the monitoring progress and impact. So Tyler, welcome to you.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, David, and to your team and the whole team from Raw Materials Week for, again, putting up such a great lineup of speakers. I've been taking lots of notes and appreciate the nice words from other colleagues previously. So yeah, I have some slides. I see them up. I'm sorry I can't be there with you in person. And I was going to talk about how do we move from setting these standards to actually monitoring whether they're achieving their results. And it's not an easy ask, and it's not an easy task for us. I can actually whiz through the first couple slides quickly, but I'll just, because they've been covered better than I could possibly do by Mr. Kabanda and Mr. Hailu. But if you go to the next slide, obviously, we know that meeting our climate goals is going to sort of, as they say, turbocharge, really dramatically increase the demand for minerals and some materials, if we're looking at not even a net zero by 2050 scenario, but what's called by the IEA, this is something we worked on with the International Energy Agency, a sustainable development scenario. We're looking at a 42 times increase, if you go next, of lithium, 25 times current production levels between now and 2040 on graphite, cobalt, etc. You all know this. This has been covered better. Next slide. And of course, as we all know as well, that African countries are major producers of critical minerals, and that many of these minerals make up a major share of African countries' GDP. And, you know, to earlier speakers' points, also emphasizes why diversification, not only of our supply base from a consumer perspective, but also of production and value addition in country is so critical here. I won't spend much more time on this because they were covered better by my previous speakers. Next slide. So, you know, we believe that responsible sourcing and due diligence is a key tool to positively shape businesses' contribution to sustainable development through their sourcing policies. And as has been referenced, the OECD has a number of standards, both very specific to minerals, the one which we've worked together with Philippe and previously Morten on DG Trade on the conflict minerals file, but also a general sector agnostic framework. I want to note that, you know, these frameworks are really designed to enable business to continue doing business in areas that might be difficult or challenging from a governance perspective. They're not aiming to drive embargoes or disengagement or de-risking. And in fact, we believe, and this is something we're looking to study more, and I'll get to it, but that implementing responsible sourcing does bring long-term value to companies and to industries because it allows them to diversify their supply base by allowing them to source from areas which might be difficult at first, and manage their reputational and legal risk to secure access to finance and market access. So it is really critical to long-term value creation. Next slide. Now, the existing evidence on the impact of due diligence as defined by the OECD is pretty sparse. Where the implementation on the ground is the most mature is probably in the 3T sector in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And even then, you would see that the results from some of the evidence on the impact of due diligence is still rather mixed. It wasn't on purpose that I only selected the positive points here, but because I'll go through some of the more downsides as well that we have seen. But on the positive side, we do, our own research shows that, well, first of all, legislation is driving better and more quality implementation of due diligence. So countries that are covered by legislation, companies perform 3 times better than those that are purely voluntary. I mean, that may seem obvious, but we do need data to show that legislation does drive performance. But more importantly, in terms of ultimate impact, the UN group of experts on the DRC has found that industry due diligence programs that comply with with OECD guidance have improved transparency in the 3T, the tin, tantal, and tungsten sector in the Great Lakes region. And other studies have shown that pretty categorically that where due diligence programs exist, there is less military or armed group interference, which is obviously one of the main aims of some of these standards. I should say, though, this isn't without its challenges. Many of these studies have shown that you know, some of the armed group interference has moved to other minerals where due diligence programs don't exist, in particular in gold, and that, and this I would say most importantly, the actual livelihoods of communities and miners is not yet improving despite some of these due diligence programs. And we would attribute this to, in part, some broader governance factors in the region that really would determine livelihood and quality of life, but also to the fact that, you know, what we are seeing right now is the impact of partial implementation, not full or quality implementation. So when we think about what we need to measure in order to understand the impact of responsible sourcing, part of it is also to measure the quality of that implementation and if it's actually meeting the benchmarks that have been set out. To date, a lot of implementation by companies tends to be binary. Either this has no risk and I do business with my eyes closed, or it has risk and I say, no, I can't do business here. And in fact, what we need to do is bridge that gap so companies use leverage and help finance actual improvement on the ground, working with suppliers over time that's monitored. Now, that's not an easy ask, but that's the direction we need to go. Next slide. So we have earlier this year released with support from the EU and Netherlands, a monitoring and evaluation framework that helps us monitor the entire ecosystem of different kind of interventions and outcomes of due diligence. And so you may not be able to read this maybe kind of complex slide. Basically, you know, when you look at what we need to monitor, we need to monitor what the drivers and the policy interventions are. So what is driving company performance? So that's on the far left. Then we need to measure company performance itself, both across the entire value chain, upstream and downstream, which is sort of in the middle. And we need to see how that company performance is then affecting the trade in minerals and the existence of due diligence on the ground in producing countries. So is it affecting trade, more increase or decrease in responsible mineral trade, and the increase or decrease in sort of on the ground efforts? And then finally, and most importantly, we then need to measure what outcomes and impacts we see associated with on the ground due diligence in terms of miners' livelihoods, in terms of you know, certain risk information like the prevalence of child labor, forced labor, but also corruption. But more importantly, we need to look at exogenous factors and socioeconomic conditions like political instability, other rule of law and governance issues that may not be directly attributed to minerals due diligence, but affect those outcomes. So it's a complex picture. Our monitoring evaluation framework was developed over 3 years with academics and experts and took a lot of head scratching. It's not perfect, but it's something that we are trying. And it combines 8 separate meta studies that would aggregate these and allow data to speak to each other to get an outcome. So we're going to be piloting this study. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see some of our initial results around the uptake side, because we can't measure impact of due diligence unless we know what level of due diligence is actually being implemented. And here, I won't go into the detail, but again, it gives you a bit of a snapshot. We're going to be releasing a study in the next month or so that takes a sample of around 600 companies globally that are using all key base metals and precious metals. So it's all users and the entire supply chain. And when our results, there's not always the prettiest picture, I should say. The best performing companies that are most under scrutiny, and that tend to be in some of the consumer goods facing category, are still only achieving close to 60% the indicators of core indicators on due diligence. So, and those are those companies that are subject to legislation. So there is still a major gap, but we have seen significant performance from 2014 to 2018, and we would hope and expect that improvement to continue. If you go now to the next slide on what are the data gaps then that we need in order to deliver on this monitoring framework and be able, and I should say that the OECD itself doesn't plan to monitor everything. We can't. And our hope is that this monitoring framework can be a common yardstick that any civil society, any multilateral can join and use the same sort of metrics to identify and collect the similar data, and then we would share it with each other and allow that data to be comparable. But what are the data gaps? Well, first of all, it's clear that there are data gaps on due diligence uptake and on the overall impact on the ground. That is the starting point. So inspection data, particularly from the small scale and artisanal small scale mining sector, is lacking completely. And that means in order for us to monitor, we need to work with organizations that already are doing those inspections on the ground or have a presence on the ground. So leveraging the capacity and knowledge that exists on the ground in producing countries, for example, in Africa, is critical. And I want to emphasize how much knowledge there is on the ground. We should not be bypassing local experts. We need to be using local experts that have that knowledge. That's whether it's civil society or academics working in these producing countries. So inspection data is missing, uptake data is missing. But another thing that's really missing is the interaction between these different nodes, between the drivers and the uptake, and between the uptake and the impact. And in particular, there are some things like the phenomenon of de-risking. in which companies avoid entire regions and production modes in order to avoid some of these responsible sourcing requirements. How big is that? What impact is that actually having? We also need to research the distribution of costs and benefits along the supply chain. We have put out a report earlier this year that showed that many upstream actors in regions that are most mature for implementing due diligence feel that they are facing undue costs, and that commercial benefits they're not yet seeing. That downstream is not paying for some of the costs and the data that they use themselves. So we need to research this more. How is that cost going to be shared, and how is that benefit? How is the cost going to go from upstream to downstream, and how are those benefits going to flow from which are currently accruing downstream further upstream? We're also looking to research on the role of control points and choke points in global metals. This is a key aspect for how responsible sourcing can work practically. Where do I get most value for money if I focus my control rather than creating audit and certification requirements for all the millions of entities using metals? How do I focus? We know smelters and refiners are a choke point, so to speak, for most metals, but there might be others. And that's something that we'd like to do also for other raw materials, not just minerals itself. And the last bit, and also the trickiest bit, is the attribution, contribution, correlation problem. How do we disentangle company efforts that might lead to change from the broader governance and rule of law and political economy in producing countries that also probably affect change on the ground in a big greater way than individual company efforts. So some of the data gaps, a lot of info for you. My next slide, in the interest of time, I'll skip it. But my next slide, basically, I wanted to touch on a little bit of also some of the work we're doing around, working with the industry programs to align with global standards. And I think we've done this in a real innovative partner way with the EU as part of the conflict minerals regulation. It's a very innovative approach. I think this is something that's going to need to be built on by regulators as they expand these requirements to other metals, because practically the industry will need mechanisms to implement these standards in complex supply chains. And there's an opportunity for policymakers to sort of govern the alphabet soup of certification initiatives. So for the battery directive, there is an opportunity here, but there are risks. And there's a lot we can learn from what we're doing currently. So if we go the way forward, the last slide, we are going to be taking forward this monitoring and evaluation framework. We encourage you all, anyone who wants to participate in this community of practice, to be able to share results and metrics and data and coordinate. It is open. We could co-brand anything. We don't want any ownership, or we want to actually make this an inclusive process. You can look forward in the next month to a new report on monitoring due diligence disclosures, and next year further work on all of this, including on our alignment of schemes. So thank you all very much, and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Tyler, for this comprehensive overview of the due diligence, particularly on the monitoring and the impact side. I think we're looking forward a lot to this report that will come out soon. It will go into the progress that's already been achieved in previous years. Okay, now we're back to the stage for our next speaker, who is sat here patiently. So thank you very much, Gaëtan, for being here, Gaëtan Ducroix. And Gaëtan is from the Bilateral and Regional Environmental Unit from DG Environment, and will tell us a little bit about circular economy and the activities that you've been doing in the context of EU-Africa cooperation. So over to you, Gaëtan.
Thank you, David. Indeed, I think it's important, and we've heard it since the start of this session, of thinking of the sustainability of raw material consumption in taking on board the circular economy potential. So let me just rapidly run through this slide, which is about the European Green Deal, the policy framework that we are working under. This is the European Growth Strategy, as you probably already heard, and it's really a strategy on the whole European economic model. So circular economy is an important part of it, but it's really a transformative policy throughout the different components, going from agriculture to energy, transport, construction. It requires cross policies, and we've heard that this was definitely needed. Just on the circular economy action plan, which is part of this European Green Deal, just to recall a bit what we mean by the circular economy. This is the first part on the slide is around our current economic model, which is basically about a linear one of extracting raw materials, manufacturing it, modifying it, and then using it during a limited time and destroying all its value. The circular economy is another model that we are aiming at, and which is of keeping the value within the economic chain for the longer period as possible. So extending the lifetime of the use period through repairing, maintaining, but also reusing, redistributing materials, refurbishing them, remanufacturing them, and eventually recycling. We often hear about the circular economy as mainly a recycling activity, but it's only part of the bigger picture of using and keeping the value of materials in the system for the longer period. What we are relying on the EU side is this circular economy action plan that you have heard about from other speakers. This is a comprehensive action plan that is looking at the actions along the entire life cycle of products within the EU. It aims at mainly designing products that are designed to last longer, to be repairable, to be reusable, recyclable, and that incorporate also as much as possible recycled components in them. There are components in this action plan that are about empowering consumers, providing them reliable info about the reusability and repairability of products. It's about ensuring that we are producing overall less waste, so that the packaging, for example, in the EU market are reusable, recyclable, and that we are also minimizing the exports of waste and tackling illegal waste shipments. There was an important new proposal from the Commission that was released yesterday on this matter on minimizing our export of waste vis-à-vis and our waste challenges vis-à-vis the external world and Africa in particular. There is a particular focus in our circular economy action plan on the key value chains, electronics and ICT, batteries and vehicles, packaging, plastics, textiles, constructions, and food, water, and nutrients. Part of this circular economy action plan, and this is where the Africa focus is about also leading the way on the global matter on these aspects. So there are a range of priority policies and strategies that we are trying to conduct at the global level, such as working towards a global agreement on plastics that would look at the issue of plastic waste throughout the full life cycle, but also developing a global alliance on circular economy and resource efficiency. This was created back in 2021 in February, and it now includes 15 members throughout the world that are pushing this agenda at the global level. It was created by the Commission together with the UNEP and UNIDO, and it includes 4 African countries among them. Part of these efforts is also to promote the circular economy in our bilateral, regional, and multilateral relations with external partners, to include these elements in free trade agreements also, to reflect our enhanced circular economy objectives, and to engage in outreach activity through the Green Deal diplomacy, some circular economy missions, and enhance coordination with our member states on this topic. More specifically on Africa, we have a new EU strategy with Africa where green transition is one of the top priority, and it includes engaging further on circular economy. We have notably on the Commission side further engaging with the African Circular Economy Alliance, which is an alliance of African governments that are steering the work. It was created by Nigeria, South Africa, and Rwanda, and it now includes 8 African members, and we are in the process of formalizing our engagement with this alliance. There is some work starting also from the African Union in developing a new expert group on circular economy and developing an African circular economy action plan that we would like to support. And other speakers have also referred to the Europe-Africa Business Forum that is expecting to happen in the margin of the next summit in February 2022, where we expect also to have circular practices showcased. And I've been working also on the inclusion of circularity in the neighborhood and development instruments, the EU external programming that Carsten mentioned about. We have also conducting a specific study on circular economy in EU-Africa cooperation that I will say a few more words on. From our DG Env perspective. I mean, our initial reflection that we knew quite few about what was going on in terms of circular economy practices in Africa. So this study was conducted last year with the objective of better understanding what was the state of play of implementing circular economy in Africa, and what was the potential impact also of the transition of circular economy in Africa, and providing recommendations of what could be circular economy transitions for the whole for EU engagement, but not only from one perspective, but looking at the whole toolbox of EU engagement with Africa, being from policy dialogues into development cooperation, into trade relations, research cooperation, business-to-business relations. There are a lot of potential elements where we could work further with Africa. So it led to one continental report and 8 more specific case studies on 8 countries where we felt the circular economy development was the most advanced. So these are Egypt, South Africa, Nigeria, Rwanda, Senegal, Morocco, Kenya, and Ghana. And these reports are available online if you're interested. So basically what came out of these reflections was that circular economy in Africa is quite new in terms of framing the type of policies in the policy context, but its principles are deeply embedded in most of the African countries, the realities. It's a policy paradigm that is gaining traction. We've heard more and more some statements and policy strategies referring to it, be it in the context of the African Ministerial Conference on Environment, being in the context of the African Union. There was also recently the release of a new Africa Green Stimulus Program that put circular economy as among the top priorities. We've mentioned it, we're in the African continent is the continent where the most economic growth is expected in the coming decades, and this is also expected to really rely on major material consumption growth, lead to this new middle class which will be coming, and we see circular economy as a solution to directly engage in a different economic model that decouple the resource and the raw material extractions and the resource use from the economic development of the continent that the continent is logically expecting. So the main drivers of the circular economy uptake in Africa is around job creation, economic development, diversification, because for the time being, we've heard it in other presentations also, a large part of the of some African economies are related to export of raw materials, and the fact that circular practices can also lead to further diversification. And of course the growing waste problem, which is recognized as a major problem in most African countries, and a growing one. The discussion so far in most African countries that we studied was that the focus was really about improving waste management to start with, recycling, but with limited holistic circular economy framework that we're looking at the whole value chain so far. So this study and another study that was also conducted by the African Circular Economy Alliance had identified few key sectorial opportunities for circular economy uptake in Africa. That includes agriculture and food production, plastics and packaging, electronics and electrical equipment, construction, fashion and textile. In each of these, there are clear potential for more circularity in the value chains. For example, in the electronics and electric equipment, to improve the waste collection of existing equipment and move from recycling to also refurbishing and remanufacturing. In the textile sector, for converting textile waste, for example, into new garments, etc., etc. So, what is interesting is that this also is mirroring somehow those sectors that the EU has identified in its own circular economy action plan. So we see also a lot of potential for engagement with Africa. I'll go rapidly over this slide about the impact of circular economy. There are definitely important economic, social, environmental benefits of moving into more circular practices. There have been a small modeling exercise done as part of these studies that identified that there could be an increase of GDP and more 11 million more jobs created into a circular economy scenario in Africa than in a business as usual scenario. So there is also a clear economic narrative for moving into this type of circular economy. And want to reiterate also the fact that of course, circular economy transition in Africa will not occur in a silo. We are engaged with African in global value chains, as it's one of EU is an important trade partner with Africa, and so far the raw material is definitely what dominates Africa's exports to the EU, and final products and second-hand products is what dominate the EU exports to Africa. So these are part of the features, but we can see in this graph, which is from an OECD study around the linkages between circular economy and trade, that this is an essential part also of the reflection around circular economy promotion. And this is where also the whole issue around illegal waste shipment from EU to Africa is something that needs to be taken in the equation. Last speakings about the key knowledge gaps that we have identified. So this was to provide a bit of the policy framework around our engagement with Africa on circular economy. But when it comes to knowledge, there are definitely need to better monitor and inform circular economy policies in Africa. And for that, there is a need for better data availability and quality and harmonized data around economic production processes, and notably all these interim production processes that are linked to repairing, leasing, etc., that not necessarily fit into the existing data. Waste generation is an area where we have very generic knowledge, but we need more in order to better inform policies. Resource consumption, this was mentioned also in another slide. The whole issue of employment and the informality of the employment, especially in the recycling industry, is an area also where it's difficult to assess exactly the number of people that are working and depending on circular economy, for example. Trade flows in waste, secondary materials, second-hand goods is also an area where more knowledge will be needed in order to better inform our policies. And finally, among the research would be needed also to investigate and measure and better. We've started this work through this study, but it's just a start, because there is a need to also better model what are the impacts and the benefits of circular economy policy, be it on the environmental front, what does it mean in terms of resource savings, in terms of pollution reduction, in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. This was mentioned in COP26 last weeks, but the potential of circular economy also to contribute to climate mitigation is something that needs to be better assessed, and the economic and social impact also. So I'll stop there. You have some links there about circular economy policies on the EU and the study I mentioned. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Gaetan. both for being here physically and also for this nice overview of the circular economy activities that you're doing. What are the drivers and really policy background to this? And also what's then going on in Africa? What are the benefits? I think you very nicely quantified those in terms of jobs, waste, environmental improvements, also on the economic development and diversification side. Very interesting that you've had modeling work on this, and then wrapping up nicely, I think, with what's the current data situation and what are the needs. Quite some big challenges, as we all know, in that dimension, particularly on the circular economy aspects. Okay, I think let's move on to our last speaker. So we should have online from Africa, Susan Karcher, who is the co-founder of the African Circular Economy Network, and also from Sustainable Recycling Industries is the South Africa National Project Manager. Hi, Susan. Susan's going to give us a little bit of an overview. Hello. A little bit of an overview on some of the knowledge challenges that exist and the pathways, particularly towards a more equitable north-south interaction in value chains with a focus on waste, electrical, electronic equipment. So over to you then, Susan.
Thank you so much. Just waiting for the presentation. Thank you. All right. Next slide. Just a quick introduction of where we're coming from. Oh, this is hard to read. Okay. The African Circular Economy Network, ACEN, is a self-funded organization. We were established in 2016 to be the voice of Africa, that we are able to actually participate and negotiate in the global wider circular economy debate, because there are certain aspects of the circular economy that are very different in Africa than they are in Europe. We have by now over 100 representatives in over 30 African countries, and we basically are a knowledge network of professionals. We work closely also together with ACEA, the African Circular Alliance, but we are not the alliance, we are the network, so not to confuse that. And just in terms of the context of sustainable recycling industries, this is a project funded by Swiss SECO and EMPA. And as the national coordinator, I run it for South Africa. It's also run in Colombia, Egypt, Ghana, Peru. The idea is that we have 4 generic outcomes for each country to develop e-waste policy, normative requirements for e-waste management, business cases, and also find solutions on hazardous waste. Okay, next slide. So just to set the specific trends, and there's really nothing new under the sun, listening to the speakers before me, but we should keep in mind that, that Africa is actually the continent, according to the African Development Bank, strongest affected by the climate change, but we actually are the least contributing to climate change. However, we see countries like South Africa being very significant emitters of carbon dioxide due to their coal dependency. Regarding the economy, what signifies Africa is that very little manufacture is going on, specifically not OEM manufacture. It's all limited basically to assembly, if you see anything that is called manufacturing. Most of the African countries are basically only resource exporters and product importers. From the demographics, we experience currently a massive population growth in many African countries, and that is the foreseeable future. And that will also set the pace of what kind of agenda we need out of the circular economy. Our population is young, our population is willing to work, and the majority is in working age. But next slide. Work is unfortunately sometimes hard to come by. And there's hardly anything like a formal 8-to-5 job to be found in Africa. This is, God, no, I can't read this. The Africans are entrepreneurs and are really opportunity driven more than anything else. And a lot of the people are actually economic survivors on a daily basis. And that also shapes the landscape. We have massive inequities of wealth in African countries. We might have countries that show a fairly good growth in terms of GDP. But if you look at the Gini index, the Gini index tells you really the story of the social inequity. And that is really so much better to measure for Africa. And that is one of the reasons why in Africa, access to goods and services as part of a circular economy agenda is so much more important than actually personal ownership. So personal ownership of a view is not what we're aiming for. We need to have access to goods and services. And it's also based on the very African principle of Ubuntu, which is really a sharing principle, which I don't think, I know I'm German as well, so I'm European, but sharing is not exactly the word that comes to mind for Europe. But in Africa, sharing is a very kind of cultural type of concept. So all of those shape the African CE agenda, the human development requirements, building resilience against climate change, and that creates obviously a need. Where is our supplementary niche in a global value chain that we can meaningfully contribute in a circular inspired global value chain? And that also basically provides the vision that ASEAN has to say that we want to build a restorative African economy that generates well-being and prosperity, which is inclusive of all its people through new forms of economic production and consumption, which maintain and regenerate its environmental resources. Next. So in order to know the status quo, we need to also understand where the value chains lie and how they function. And first we want to basically look at the one for electronics equipment. So it's marked by, obviously, as you said earlier, large-scale primary mining activities in Africa. So we are a huge importer of primary mining products. For Europe, they receive at a fairly low-priced export because a lot of prices or costs of those mining activities are actually externalized. It's a huge contributor to South Africa's GDP, and what is taken out there, we heard it earlier also from conflict countries, are critical raw materials, gold, cobalt, copper, tantalum. All of those are crucial building blocks for the manufacturing of electronic equipment. And Europe, with this Green Deal, is currently obviously full on in a transition, an energy transition, and needs for its own plans for decarbonization and energy transition a lot of raw materials to build windmills, EV solar plants, and hydrogen plants. And if you follow the value chain, the raw materials are extracted, the manufacturing of the parts happens in China, and then the assembly would then go typically from Asia to Europe, and then Europe would utilize the electronics until its useful lifetime. Next. And if you turn this value chain around, it looks like that in Europe, there is the WE directive, which is obviously really useful because in Europe, the producers fulfill the EPR obligations of safe take back and recycling of e-waste in Europe. However, we know the story. Some of the e-waste leaks out of Europe, is smuggled sometimes amongst functional second-hand equipment. That happens a lot, or is coming out under the guise of a donation when it has reached almost end of life. Unfortunately, in Africa, EPR systems are only emerging slowly. They do emerge, but very slowly. And wherever there is no legislation in place, the informal sector finds a space. And they actually have 90% in many countries of the treatment markets at their hands. And they do recycle, but it comes at a very high environmental health and safety cost to everyone. Interesting enough, that obviously because of a value proposition, they also prefer to recover functionality over just materials recovery. And that makes them real experts. I've seen with my own eyes people that have managed to work still on functional Windows 98 systems computers in Ghana. So having said that, the benefit from materials recovery are limited. As far as we get in Africa is the value of fractions. And then again, the end processing capacity is lacking, which means things get exported back to the places in Europe, like Umico or Boliden, where you have the refining facilities. Next. So the question is, perhaps we're seeing this net, but the dependency, the continued dependency to export primary resources, is that not perhaps keeping Africa in what I would call a linear lock-in position? That is something that I'm very worried about personally, because Also, the dependency to export the secondary materials adds further to that. So we export primary resources and then we export secondary resources again. And unfortunately, it's only the value fraction. The problematic fractions are retained in Africa without any treatment technology. And that is a huge problem. So literally the current value chain position of Africa, both for electronics as well as for e-waste, actually empowers people on this continent at triple bottom line level, environmentally, socially, and economically. And it really masks Africa's own circular economy ambitions. It might become unattainable for Africa with a lack of both finances and resources to fulfill its own vision. Next. Because there are future developments to keep in mind for Europe. Africa also has its own CE visions, and some of the documents where you can find evidence of this is the Circular Economy Alliance's Big 5 Bets, which is a report that was recently published talking about the big wins of circular economy for Africa. We also see from the African Union Development Agenda, the Africa we want. It starts speaking about Africa as a powerhouse for the rest of the world, but obviously a powerhouse needs resources. So again, you know, we need to take cognizance of this. And then there is obviously also Africa's own energy transition plans based on our historical energy mix. And South Africa, where I'm living now, is actually a prime candidate. We are sitting on an 80% coal dependency. And actually, South Africa is the 12th biggest carbon emitter in the world and the worst sulfur dioxide polluter in its category, even surpassing China and the USA combined. Next. So what is really exciting is that we might have a watershed moment coming for South Africa, and that just recently happened at the COP26, because South Africa has secured a multi-billion-dollar deal now with developed nations worth 131 billion rand over the next 3 to 5 years, where the EU, UK, USA have partnered to support South Africa's own climate action and decarbonization goals. And the areas of funding, interesting enough, the same as for Europe: renewable energy investment, electric vehicles, green hydrogen, and also the decommissioning of the coal power station for solar and battery storage. So what really needs to also happen is that there's transition funding that can assist South Africa to shift coal-dependent businesses and also entire communities, because where communities live, for example, in the Platinum Belt, what are we going to do with those people? The people need to be retrained. They need to be retrained on meaningful green kind of jobs. Those funds have been pledged in form of grants, concessional loans, investments, and so on. So I think there's a great opportunity, but there's also significant risks, because we have those issues and we have to spell them out. Corruption is a problem. Lack of commitment of politicians is a problem, and also huge social implications. Shifting into a green decarbonization in countries where so many people and so much of the GDP depends on non-renewable resources needs to be thought out very, very carefully. Next. So what are the ingredients really for the EU-African partnership success? Well, I think there is this adage saying, leave no one behind. And the future EU growth model must really not compromise Africa's opportunities. So please don't leave Africa in the dust. It needs to be part. There needs to perhaps also be a willingness to rethink the terms and the conditions of current trade agreements. I think historically they were always very biased in one direction and only benefiting a certain type of company or industry size. I spoke with a very interesting gentleman, Ernst Ulrich von Weizsäcker from the Club of Rome, and he suggested a very radical idea that has lodged itself in my head. How about we start leasing Africa's resources wealth instead of selling it? What implications would that have for Europe if Africa would remain the owner, the rightful owner of its primary resources, and would therefore not forfeit its opportunities at a certain stage to get them back and to actually start its own energy transition? Then also what we find is that any partnership that is thought or business relationship between Europe and Africa, it needs to come with the delivery of wider social justice. And I was happy to hear this earlier, social justice that trickles down right to the guy on the ground. So whatever projects are kept in mind, the key performance indicator must be, what does it do for the human development, for the people on the ground? So building inclusive last mile transparent value chains through blockchain is another super exciting development. And we can see this right now through organizations such as BankU that work with the likes of Coca-Cola and can really create a last mile transparency that can actually really pick up what is the contribution of the informal collector bringing the stuff to a buyback center. And that is vital that we can actually start developing more fair and transparent value chains all the way down to Europe. I think Africa offers a historical cultural knowledge on how to live according to circular basic principles every day. We might not have so many policies and so many words about it, but people intrinsically have the DNA in them to live, you know, according to circular economy principles. So what I foresee is that the future role of Africa must be a hub for remanufacturing, for repair, for building industries that are built on utilizing secondary materials. And one of the facts that supports this is Walter Starhill's comparison to say, if you look at the ratio of man hours per kilogram of resources, if you remanufacture an engine versus you make an engine out of virgin resources, your ratio of man-intense contact time is 270 to 1. So that is a very powerful argument for me. We would like to see Africa as a future European circular economy strategy partner far beyond materials recycling. I feel we are pushed much in that corner of just being that provider of those resources that are going elsewhere. And also then a value chain partner to keep its functionality as long as possible. And I just heard today that Apple is now planning for its iPhone 12 and 13 to make it fully repairable. So can we please consider Africa to become the hub, the skills place and technical center of excellence to keep our electronics alive for longer? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Susan, for that final overview. And I think that very interesting points again on the circular economy, also bringing in some cultural considerations. That was quite interesting. And definitely the recommendations at the end. So I think that that concludes our session on the knowledge needs with this Africa-EU focus. So firstly, I would like to thank all the speakers. So I think it's been quite an intense session for everybody, a lot of information from everybody. Sorry, unfortunately, we don't have time for questions. We're out of time. So, but thank you to the speakers for that. Thank you to the audience, both here and online. So I hope you find this useful. I hope also that these presentations will have a longer life expectancy and be available to you through YouTube in the future, not just today. And also, as we promised, we will have a follow-up report that will try to distill all the different messages, the many of them to comprehend in such a time. So we'll try and capture and distill those in the follow-up report along with the abstracts provided by speakers, their slides and speeches as far as possible. And hopefully have that report from Tamas Hamner and Eleanor de Elia in the coming months. Thank you again also to DG Grow, to the various colleagues that have been involved, both in the concept of this and also in making this Raw Materials Week a good success, both online and also physically here in Brussels. And the team supporting all the logistics with quite some complicated switches and interactions and people coming and going from different regions and so forth. That's quite a tricky challenge. So I'd like to close this meeting and okay, and thank you very much again to everybody. Bye-bye.